It's a new, more radical form of socialism in South Africa.
Let's focus on the land. Expropriation of land without compensation. Tell me what it means to you, because it means lots of things to lots of people.
No, it means it's very simple. The state owns the land. It means exactly what's happening in China. The state owns the land.
So what we hear the South African government saying now is that this policy of expropriation without compensation, as they call it, is something that has to be done in order to give the property, to redistribute the wealth from the wealthy to the poor. While we do know that this is definitely not the case, this is not what the South African government is trying to achieve. We can see it clearly from the redistribution policies that has been executed to date, where the intention and the goal was for the state to own these properties, for the state to get more control, more centralized control. And this is something that, as we know and any thinking person would know, would be destructive for the economy. I think another important point to mention is South Africa does have a very controversial history of racial discrimination and of land ownership and dispossession of land and so forth. And it is certainly true that in South Africa's history it has in fact happened that certain communities were deprived of their land, and that land was then taken by the state during the previous administration. And that is something that has to be corrected. I think it's a moral stance to take. The problem is that the consequence thereof is government has not gained enough control. Now government wants more control, and that's why they are pushing through with this policy. It's a new, more radical form of socialism in South Africa. And you can call it socialism with Chinese characteristics. The form of socialism that we know was made famous, I think, by Deng Xiaoping in China. So it's socialism, it's looking to Marxism and Leninism, but getting China involved, getting China to back these countries up on an international sphere. And what's effectively happening is that these countries, South Africa and other African countries, are becoming pawns of the Chinese government and the Communist Party of China in this international game that, of course, China's involvement is simply to have China's interests at heart, and we know the consequences thereof is more Chinese control globally, which would have an impact on the US. So we are fighting this policy, and we will continue to do so. We do, however, believe that it's also in the interest of the US to take a public stance about this, and also to put the South African government on terms, to say you are in the process of violating trade agreements with the US because you are disrespecting property rights, and this is something that has to stop.
Afriforum is the largest civil rights organization in Africa, and there's millions of people in Africa that support free market principles and who support Western values. What we are seeing in South Africa is that our governments and many governments in Africa turn to China and think that socialism in Africa can still work. In South Africa, the case is that the government is looking at a policy of expropriating private property without compensation. That means that they want to take away our property and not give us any payment for that. This will have detrimental effects on the economy and on each and every person in South Africa.
So what we've seen in many African countries, and also in South Africa in particular, is that many of these countries still look to China thinking that socialism is something that could work. And we've had, for example, the situation in Zimbabwe that was a vicious circle where the government tried this policy of expropriating private property without compensation, particularly the land. The policies of Robert Mugabe chasing the farmers off their land, getting the land and so forth. And the consequence thereof was, of course, that many Western countries took a firm stance against this. The economic destruction of that country as a result of these policies was then blamed on the West and on the US, saying, well, the reason why the country is in shambles is because the US initiated sanctions and because Western countries have turned their backs on us and so forth. And the consequence thereof is what is described as the Look East policy. So what happens then is these countries then look to China. And China, of course, is very eager to step in, to pick up the bill. And then the consequence thereof is, of course, that these countries fall into a debt trap. And they are linked to China as a result of this large amount of debt that they have to pay. If the US is not to take action in this regard, the appropriate action, whether by diplomatic pressure and so forth, the consequence would be that China would get more access to Africa's abundance of resources, mineral resources, coal resources and so forth. But also that China would get more and more control over the African continent, And other than that, another negative consequence would be that more and more countries, particularly African countries, are aligning themselves with China and the ideals of the Communist Party of China on a global scale. Socialism in Africa and the role that China is playing behind the scenes is something that does have a direct impact on the interests of the USA.
We are here in the United States to speak to the government as South Africa have trade agreements with the US. And some of the conditions for that trade agreements is that we support a free market as well as private property rights in South Africa. So what the effect will be is that the US will be able to cancel that agreement with South Africa if our government goes forth with this policy. So we will be asking the US government to put South Africa on terms, to put pressure on our government to stop this policy. And we believe that we can still stop socialistic policies like expropriation without compensation in South Africa.